So the style jig I usually use for this, what I've used in the past that I've remade multiple times, is basically just a couple pieces of wood glued and screwed together attached to my miter gauge. The problem with these are over time they always get thrown off squareness. It's hard to get the pieces aligned and then your box joints won't line up. So I saw a design online that I modified a little bit to make it original enough to feel comfortable making a video of it, and it has adjustability and it also has multiple contact points with my table saw, so hopefully over time all of that stuff stays square. I'm going to start off this build with cutting some MDF I had laying around my shop, and like I said, this is original enough ideal. It has roots and originality, but it stems from someone else's ideal, so I won't be selling plans or anything like that for this. I'm just making the video, but as you see as I go, I try to put measurements on everything. Certain sizes of things, like the size of the MDF base, the size of the vertical perpendicular base to the bottom, those were all based on just scrap I had around the shop. If yours is 6 inches tall instead of 5.5, it's still going to work. So I wouldn't get super crazy. There are a couple things that are super important when dialing in this jig, and I will mention those as they come. So like I said, I just made a 3/4 inch groove in an MDF base that's going to hold this piece of plywood that I'm using for the top. Like I said, I don't love MDF, but for jigs it's going to stay it's going to be as dimensionally stable as a product you can get, probably aside from metal or plastic, which is going to be more expensive. And then to make sure that this perpendicular vertical portion of this jig stays square, I'm going to be putting some angled backs on it. They're not 45s, the angle's I believe 37 degrees, but they'll serve the same purpose. They'll make it so this can't torque forward or backwards, throwing off those cuts. So that's pretty simple stuff, just a couple of dado joints, and then I could go through and cut some more scrap ply. Like I said, all of this was based on materials I had in the shop. I didn't want to spend any money on this jig, and I didn't spend any money on it. I was able to source all of the parts with stuff I had. So I could just put that scrap piece of ply in there. I can mark where I want that angle. Like I said, it worked out to be about 37 degrees. I could take this to the chop saw and then cut those edges off, because I only need 4, so I could cut one side, flip it over, cut the other, and then I could change the fence back to square and cut 4 more. So that's how I went about doing that. And then once I had those, I could glue all this together. So you can see I'm now making my straight line. I can move this back to 90 degrees and then finish those up. So this is going to be an extremely important part is gluing this together. And one of the reasons I spend the extra time making dados and rabbet sorts of joints instead of butt joints is when you have butt joints, gluing things together can push things out of square. It can be hard to get things aligned. These joints not only make this more structurally stable, but it's easier to glue stuff together when everything lines up with those joints. Before I glued this stuff, I'm going to drill 2 5/16 inch holes through the back of this. It's very important that these are on the same plane. It doesn't really matter where they line up on the back of this. You don't want them too far to the bottom, obviously, but it's really important that they're on the same plane. So you can see, accounting for this sinking into the base, it's 2.5 inches up, and like I said, it's really important they're both exactly 2.5 inches up. So that's what everything looks like before glue up, and this is the main structure of the base. I made this in less than a half an hour. And then, like I said, the glue. So things will want to slide around on you as soon as you put glue on them, which is why, like I said, you can see everything will stay in its place because you have all of these grooves for the glue up. And then obviously I'm going to make sure that all of this stays square while it dries. So I'm going to sink a couple brads in there. I'm going to have my square as I go, so I could push this against the square, make sure it stays square. Like I said, sink a brad in there, and that's more than enough for this to set up while it glues. Sometimes if you put clamps on stuff, the clamps will want to force parts apart, so I just use brads in this case, and then when it dried, before it dries, I'm going to make sure I could slide that square across the whole face and everything's perfect. There's no gaps. So once this was dry, just to reinforce the bottom, I'm going to sink some screws in here. I'm going to countersink them and then put some screws through. You want to make sure these are countersunk so you don't scratch up the top of your table saw. I'm using drywall screws, which I always have in the shop. They're not ideal for going through composites and plywood, but it's more than suitable enough for something like this. So then for my runners, I'm going to be using Corian, and this is my crosscut sled that I made probably 10 years ago. It's in desperate need of a rebuild, and I just used MDF for that. I've seen people use plywood. It's not a terrible material, but you could see over time it wears on those runners and it starts to have some movability in it. I'm using Corian, I've used metal, stuff like that you can use repetitively. You won't have to worry about it wearing out as much. Now Corian's a material they use for countertops, and it's basically an acrylic resin with some minerals in it. And someone gave me a piece of this, there's the dimensions of it, and I've used it for multiple jigs. Obviously you're not going to go out and buy a huge slab of a countertop, but I've seen this stuff reasonably priced on eBay. And like I said, since it's essentially a plastic, I won't have to worry about it changing with seasonal humidity. It's going to stay in those runners, and like I said, I've used it on other jigs, and it's great stuff. When I run out of that supply, I'll probably end up trying to find some myself. So then I have all this lined up. I'm checking for square. You want this to be square to your blade. If it's not, this will not work. So you can see I have this lined up with the fence, so I'm letting it set against my table saw fence, which is locked in place, and then I'm just super gluing this to that Corian. I roughed it up since it's a plastic. It's gonna be a little harder to adhere stuff to it. So I roughed it up, I glued it, I have it set up against my fence. I checked it against my blade multiple times so that it was square, and then like I said, this was super glue, so it set up pretty quickly. And once it was set up, I'm also going to countersink some screws into this Corian, just in case that super glue joint over time wants to kind of pop off. I don't know if that's rated permanently for certain types of plastics, so just to be on the safe side, I put some screws in there. Now this is a plastic, so you can see I'm countersinking and then pre-drilling through the plastic. If you don't do that, sometimes plastics, this has happened to me with plexi, they'll split if you don't drill a big enough hole. And then I could flip this over and make sure it slides. I opted for two tracks because I just think it's going to stay true longer that way. I've seen people do it with one. I had the material for two. I think it's a better design. And then I could just start cutting that initial cut, and you can see the blade is going to come out the back side. That's going to be a common problem with any sort of jigs like this. So what I did was I just took some more scrap ply, and I'm just going to make a thick backside here so that blade is never exposed to myself, and it's always covered. Now for that part, I let it dry outside of the table saw, and it threw off my dimensions a little bit, so it was a little bit of a rough slide in that track. So if you are doing that, I recommend gluing that in place and letting it set up in the track. So the front piece is basically the exact same size as my glued in perpendicular, and this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to sink a T-track into the back of this. I have 5/16 T-bolts, and that is going to be the adjustability part of this jig. So I could put those T-bolts in place, I could slide the track on, and then I could line it up with this piece of plywood I cut a groove in that plywood, and then this is basically ready to go. Now I had T-track around the shop. I steal T-track from other jigs that I'm not using, and when I need this piece of T-track, I'll take it out of here and put it on something else. I haven't bought T-track in years because I've just recycled it from other pieces. So once again, there's the dimensions. T-track comes in all different sizes. That happens to be mine. It's 11/16 by a half. So I'm basically cutting an 11/16 inch dado by a ½ inch where my marks were. Now the nice thing about this is if I mess this up, I always have this cabinet grade ply around the shop. I can cut this as many times as possible. It's really important that this part turns out accurate. And then I could just put that T-track in there, make sure it sets right at the face so there's no grinding on the back side. You can see this piece wasn't long enough, but that's okay. I'll never have to adjust it that much. And then I could just attach this with 1/2-inch screws because I don't want the screws to come through the front of the face. Once again, I took this off of my router jig, so I took the screws as well. And then I could just slide that on my T-bolts, and then everything tightens. So this is the adjustability I've been talking about the whole video. If this ever gets thrown out of square, instead of the whole jig being ruined, I can loosen those bolts and slide it. The other nice thing about a detachable face is I'm making this jig for 3/8-inch finger joints. It's very easy to make another face front for 1/2 inch or 3/4 and have multiples and swap them out based on your project. So now in order to get this thing all lined up and start cutting some joints, my key is going to be 3/8-inch, like I mentioned. I had some mahogany around the shop because I've been working on a mahogany project, so I'm using that as my key. It's a nice solid hardwood that's fine grain, that doesn't have any knots or anything in it, so it will work perfect for this. So I have a 3/8-inch Dado stack in my blade. I'm going to cut an initial groove down the middle. I'm going to raise the blade to just about the height of the key stock because that is going to be the groove that I'm cutting in my piece. You can see it's just a little bit, it's okay if it's a little too high, but you just don't want it excessively high because you're gluing that in place. And then I could cut that groove. Now this groove is going to be the initial alignment. I cut that key I had into a couple pieces so that I had enough for a spacer. So I put a couple in the groove, and then that is my spacer. That's going to give you the spacing of the finger joint, and then that is going to be my key. So I can line all that up. This is just a little bit of super glue. You don't want to glue this to the back of the piece. You just want to glue it to the adjustable part. I almost wiped it off with my finger before I remembered it was super glue. I wiped off the excess with a little piece of paper towel. I could put my spacer in place, slide this over. You could see it kind of tweak that bit. I don't want it slid over all the way, and then I could tighten that. So then I was pretty excited to test this out, and I didn't raise the blade to match my stock, which is 3/4 inch. So you'll see I have to cut these twice. They're a little too small. I remembered I needed to raise it, and that's what that is. And then, like I said, this is a very simple jig, easily made in 1/2 hour to an hour. And then it's time to test it before I do my finished piece. The whole point of making this was for a project, but I also have been meaning to remake one of these because it's a very useful joint. A lot of times when I'm making box joints now, I use dovetails because I have a dovetail jig. But the nice thing about this one is I can make these boxes as wide as I want. You're kind of limited with dovetails. And this was my first test joint. You could see I didn't have the blade risen enough, so they're a little recessed, which might work out for plywood because you could fill that with filler, but my first test cut turned out perfect. Now the way to really test this is on uneven material, which is easy to find at most stores. This is just a 1x4 furring strip, and if I could get this whole piece, this is about a 12-inch piece, to fit, that means all of my alignments are perfect. In the past, a lot of issues I've had with these jigs I've made that are a little faster and don't have all this perfect alignment. The first couple joints will be perfect, and then gradually, even if it's off by 1/32 of an inch, by the time you get to the end, nothing lines up, which could be a nightmare when you're cutting these on expensive material. So this furring strip worked out perfectly. This is exactly what I want, just a nice solid joint. You can tap it into place. You don't want to have to beat it into place. Tap it into place, and I was really happy with that. So that is basically the jig. If you're watching this video just to learn how to make the jig, that was it. Like I said, pretty simple, straightforward. I used all materials I had in the shop. Like I said, if you're new to this, probably an afternoon project. If you're a little bit versed in woodworking, maybe an hour or two worth of work, and most of that's glue time. But to finish up this video, I figured I'd show you what I made this jig for, which is going to be a rather sizable toy box that's going to have a name stenciled onto it, which I didn't show in this video because it wasn't done in time. But like I said, I couldn't cut this on my dovetail jig, so I decided to spend the time making one of these because it's very versatile. I love these sorts of joints that fit together nicely. It's also not necessarily as aesthetically pleasing as a dovetail, but it still also looks nice. I have multiple older boxes made of finger joints. They last hundreds of years if you take care of them. They're still pretty true. And then you could see I cut all that pine, used the joint, and everything lined up perfectly. Got all four corners nicely. So that is what that box is going to look like. Now, if you're using wide material like I am, the material is not going to be perfectly flat. So before you clamp and glue it together, you're naturally going to have little gaps like that. That's really nothing to be too concerned about. The big concern is the alignment of the finger joints. Like I said, if it's off by even a 32nd of an inch, compounded over 20 cuts, it won't line up at all. So then for the bottom, I'm just putting a groove because I'm putting a plywood base in this bottom. Now, if you're doing through dados like this, you're going to have a little bit of a piece kicked out on the edge, but this is going to be painted, so I could easily patch that. I didn't have to worry about it. So my groove lines up nicely because all of my joints are accurate. If your box is also off alignment by a little bit, when you go to cut that bottom groove, it will also be off. So that's the little piece I was talking about that gets cut out. I could add my base, and then that is basically going to be it for this video. Really simple jig. I think it's a great jig for beginner woodworkers to make. It adds a little bit of aesthetic appeal to your projects. It's easy to make, and like I said, you could swap out the faces to get different size joints. And the nicest part about it is this box will last a lifetime versus something that was made from MDF and just braided together with butt joints, especially something for kids. No one will wreck something faster than a child.